सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The biggest headline out of the G20 is actually not from G20. It is from the sidelines of G20. But that's how diplomacy works. Something has been going on the sidelines over the past 2 years at many summits, many meetings, and that has now come to fruition because all the principles involved in this project, in this project that now promises to change not just global economics, the trading systems, but also rebalance geopolitics, which is called India, Middle East, European corridor. This has been in the works for 2 years. Now at G20, all the leaders of the major nations were there. Who are the major nations involved in this? India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, America, and then EU or EC, but more specifically also Italy, France, and Germany, 3 of the biggest countries in continental Europe. So they've come together and they've announced this initiative. Now, by this time, all of you have read some basic details of the initiative. So let me go over some of these, especially the geopolitical, also economic, and frankly also geographical issues involved with this, because geography it is that will bring in the challenges and the opportunities. So first of all, geopolitics. Let me first tell you what it is and what it is not. Or maybe I reverse the order and say what it is not and what it is. Because an immediate presumption has been made, oh, now the world has got together and India is in it, or maybe India is leading it. World has got together under India's leadership or not, depending on where you argue from, to counter China, that this actually isolates China, that the Western countries, the key Western countries, almost the entire G7, not all of the G7, but almost the entire G7 and the big Middle Eastern countries and India, the 5th largest economy in the world, soon to be the 3rd largest, they've all got together to isolate China and to do something on their own. So first of all, this initiative is not that. This initiative is not to isolate China, because all the partners in this initiative are actually friends of China and they value their friendship. Friendship, such as friendship is defined in global diplomacy. None of them is hostile to China. Even America is not hostile to China. America will come to a standstill if imports from China stop for 2 weeks. India will come to a standstill if imports from China stop for 2 weeks. So China is a very integral part of global economy and global supply chains. That's not going to change, and this is not an effort to isolate China. In fact, Chinese participation, at least participation of Chinese trade, will also be critical to the economic feasibility of this India, Middle East, Europe corridor. For example, if they bring in their goods to Gwadar and want to send these to a UAE port and then to be loaded onto the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, everybody will be very happy. Everybody will gratefully do it. Nobody will say just because these are Chinese goods, we will not carry them. Similarly, imports going to China through Gwadar could also come in through this corridor. Let me also tell you what it is. What it is it's competition for China. It's a challenge for China and a competition for China that, look, you have a lot of spare money. You thought you had these humongous multi-trillion-dollar foreign exchange reserves. You also had humongous state surpluses. You also needed more markets for your goods, and you had the goods that everybody wants to price, particularly at the prices at which you are selling them. Because you had these surpluses, you had come up with these great ideas of infrastructurally getting the whole world together, of getting the movement of trade, people, energy, etc. faster, cheaper, and in the process building infrastructure in a lot of countries. That is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Also, although the Chinese have changed that name many times, I will come to that in just a few minutes. So the Chinese so far had a monopoly on multi-geography. I won't just say multinational or across nations, pan-national, but multi-geography infrastructure building. So you could go from one end to Asia to the other end of Europe and into Africa, and then from Africa, Middle East, everywhere. So Chinese, through BRI, they were building a belt and a road. At one point, it was also called 1B, 1R, one belt, one road. I will come to that in a minute. So this idea now is that, listen, Chinese friends, you've got competition. We are not against you. We are not going to stop you, and we are not going to stop anybody from doing business with you, also being part of your OBOR. But remember, as Prime Minister Modi said also in his opening remarks, this is an initiative that will not threaten anybody and that will not bring you under any debt burden. That's a direct message to China, because the Americans also, they don't want to fight China. They want to keep trading with China. At the same time, they want to balance China. So this is a balancing action. And once again, for the countries who've been borrowing big time from China to build their infrastructure, their railway lines, their ports, even schools, colleges, etc., alongside those railway lines and ports, for them also, there is a message that, look, you don't just have to go to China and borrow at usurious terms, which if you are not able to repay, Chinese will take your asset, because Chinese don't lend you without any collateral. This is a different deal. This is a deal among countries who either have the money to spend or who can raise money from multilateral developmental banks, the World Bank, ADB, for example. So if you look at the participants in this project, at least two of the major participants actually have very sizable sovereign wealth funds and a lot of surplus cash. Those two being Saudi Arabia and UAE. Then America, I know the joke is that they can always print the dollar, but America is the richest country in the world and they can put money into this project. Then you have Europe. Europe for a long time has been sitting on their surpluses and on their earnings, and Europe also wants some activity, and Europe also needs to balance China. They are not going to fight China. Right now they are finding it tough enough to be fighting Russia. They are not going to fight China, and certainly they don't want to, at least they don't dream of fighting Russia and China together. In their ideal world, they will separate China and Russia. They will isolate Russia from China while staying on with China. But at the same time, they want balance, because they are also particularly concerned geostrategically with this rising or growing China-Russia nexus. So they also, one, they will benefit from trade. They will benefit from transit costs coming down, because they are importing countries as well and exporting countries. At the same time, they will see it as a strategic project. So they are not poor countries, they are rich countries, they are G7 countries. And India. India is a country with finite resources. India does not have a sovereign wealth fund. Don't confuse India's foreign exchange reserves with savings. These are not our savings or our deposits. Foreign exchange reserves in a country like India, as we mentioned to several times, means something else, because we are a country with deficits of various kinds, especially trade deficit. But India is a large country. It's a big market. One, it can produce a lot that will go onto this corridor. Second, it can consume a lot. It does already consume a lot that comes through this route and will come through this corridor. And most importantly, India has the credibility to be able to raise loans, monies from either multilateral lending organizations like the World Bank, and also some sovereign powers like the Japanese, for example. Japanese have found India to be a very good borrower, and Japanese loans come at a very low price. See the Delhi Metro. Delhi Metro is the magic of cheap Japanese loans, and cheap Japanese loans are building a lot of other infrastructure in India. So India has the ability to raise cheap borrowings. If you combine all of that, you see a real powerhouse coming up, a real powerhouse effect behind this project. And see how this works. That just as this was announced, on the same day, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, she had a meeting, she had a bilateral with the Chinese premier who had come in place of Xi Jinping, the president, Li Qiang, and she confirmed to him that Italy was withdrawing from BRI. Italy, by the way, was the only member of G7 to have joined BRI, and they were now withdrawing it. Now, if you see the original plan of BRI, at least the wing that was going through Europe, it was going to reach the port of Trieste in Italy. I'm trying to get the Italian pronunciation as right as possible. Now, if you see Trieste, this is really north of Italy. In fact, even beyond Venice, and on a thin strip of land, thin strip of Italian land with Slovenia on one side and the Adriatic Sea on the other. So if the Chinese thought you could get goods from Asia to Trieste, then the rail network would take it all over Europe. Now, Italy is out of that scheme of things. In fact, in May itself, Italy had indicated to the Chinese that they did not want to continue with the project. And obviously, that has come as a result of pressure from other G7 countries, particularly after the war in Ukraine and the growing proximity between Russia and China. So once again, there is geopolitics involved there. Now, what exactly will this project be? So first of all, look at India's problems and the problems it solves for India. India, in so many funny ways, India has such a vast coastline. But when it comes to our large land borders, India is like a landlocked country because, you don't choose your neighbors. Your neighbors are who your neighbors are. So on the west, the Pakistanis don't let us go anywhere. So we have the Af-Pak problem in the west. Even if in the best of worlds, Pakistanis agreed, who will ensure any stability or safety for any transit through Afghanistan. So on the west, we have the Af-Pak problem, but I would say more a Pak-Pak problem. Even if you are able to resolve that, then you have the Iran problem because Iran is under sanctions. Iran and India have very good relations, but Iran has been under sanctions for a long time and we don't know what the future is. Again, in the best of all worlds, Iran might see sanctions getting lifted. Right now, as we speak, there is a deal that's going to be implemented between the Americans and the Iranians, where the Americans will have a lot of the Iranian funds, I think $7 to $8 billion worth, released. These funds have been kept in escrow because of the sanctions, and in exchange, Iranians will release a bunch of American prisoners who they've been holding. These are people of Iranian extraction but American citizens. So they are going to be released. That process is on. In fact, some of these prisoners have already been sent to what is described as house arrest. That is a step. So they've come a step closer to deal being finalized. So that may or may not happen, we don't know. So the west of India is blocked like that. Otherwise, the route India had chosen, for example, in desperation, that was the route of building Chabahar, which is just 70 odd kilometers from Gwadar, 70 odd kilometers further west of Gwadar, and from there Indian goods, personnel, etc. could go in, offloaded at Gwadar, and then sent through Iran or through Afghanistan into Central Asia, then to Russia, and through Russia into Europe. That was called INSTC. That is International North-South Transport Corridor. Now that work had gone on. We know that it's been almost 16, 17 years that work on Chabahar has gone on. And this has also been seen in competition with Gwadar, not far away as I mentioned. But you know what? One, Iran is caught under sanctions. So it's very difficult to make more investment there, to also send more stuff out through Iran. If that wasn't tough enough, if that wasn't challenging enough, India was still, by the way, investing in Chabahar because of the larger geopolitical interest, also because that was a route into Afghanistan. Because Pakistanis don't even let us take our wheat, which we might be gifting to Afghan people, or even our high nutrition biscuits, which we make for Afghan children. The Pakistanis they even create problems sending that across India to Afghanistan. So aid, trade, both to Afghanistan could go on through Chabahar. That was the one objective. The other was also sending goods through Iran into Russia and then into Europe. All of that has now come to a standstill because Iran is under sanctions. Afghanistan has been taken over by the Taliban, so we don't know how long will it be when Afghanistan becomes a relatively normal country. Russia is under sanctions, which at this moment look even more severe than Iran's sanctions. Ahead of Russia, we know what's happening in Ukraine. That's a large landmass as well. So once again, that entire region has become problematic. India had to find a solution at this end. If you look at India's eastern end, it's not as if things are not as bad as on the western end, but things are not easy. So the whole idea of an eastern corridor, look east policy, etc., on the ground, it has some challenges. With Bangladesh, many improvements have been made, and now you see this railway connectivity coming up between Bangladesh and India, both from West Bengal and Tripura. That's a wonderful thing. So with Bangladesh, there's been very good progress. But for India to go further east, Myanmar has to become again a relatively more normal country. And Myanmar regime has to become relatively less unacceptable to a lot of the world, particularly the Western world. The Western world are India's friends. Even if it doesn't become acceptable, it has to become less unacceptable. That's a long haul also. And that, however, and it's important, that will also be very important, very critical for the economic success of the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Because it's not just India's goods or goods coming into India that will ride this corridor. It should also be able to service countries to India's east, that's Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on. And for that to happen, Myanmar has to settle down. But that is one challenge that is not as big a challenge as, say, the challenge to the West. So this corridor resolves both these issues for India. At least it resolves the Western challenge for India. The Eastern challenge, it creates an incentive for the states there, especially Myanmar, to get their act together. Also, it gives an incentive for the rest of the world to work together to bring Myanmar to some sort of normalcy, because that will be critical to making this project economically viable. So that is the one big difference. Second, it gives Pakistan something to think about, because so far Pakistan thought that they had enormous power over India by denying them access to Central Asia, to west of India. Now, this does not solve India's immediate Central Asian access problem, but it solves a large part of it, which is Europe. So, okay, Central Asia, you can't reach by road or rail, but you don't need a Central Asian corridor now. You don't need a transit through Central Asia to reach Europe. There is an alternative, and that will make Pakistanis something to think about. That look, are we gaining from this policy, just cutting our noses to spite our neighbor, or should we review our policy? Because if this continues, then Pakistan has no choice but to be reduced to an interest-paying and a rent-paying courtier of the Chinese. So this also gives Pakistanis, at least those Pakistanis who think seriously about their sovereignty, something to think about in terms of their choices. Next point, this strengthens India's outreach to the Middle East. It formalizes India's outreach to the Arab Middle East. Now we know that Prime Minister Modi, ever since he took power, he has taken a big leap in that direction. In fact, he became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit UAE after 36 years. He's got the topmost national awards in those countries. Now, when this relationship is so strongly bonded and formalized, I do believe, and I do argue, it's not an opinion, it's really analysis, that this will also smoothen the edges of some of the more polarized elements of Indian politics. To take you back to a couple of controversies, the CAA, NRC controversy, and after that what happened on the streets of various cities, including Delhi, and also then that controversy over the remarks that somebody made about the Holy Prophet, which brought immediate protests from India's friends in the Arab world. UAE and Saudi Arabia are now India's strategic allies and friends. And this bonding in a formal corridor in which tens of billions of dollars are invested by any of these countries, and in which such heavy stakes lie, and in which the big powers of the world, frankly, all of G7 has very heavy stakes. I think that will contribute to smoothening. It will not change the polarized Indian politics, but it will contribute to smoothening the sharper or the shriller edges of the Indian polarized debate and Indian polarized politics, because Arabs now have to be your friends, and they are your strategic friends. And Arabs, as we know, are not just Muslim countries, but Saudi Arabia, is the home of the holiest mosques and the holiest places in Islam, and the Saudi ruling family has a very special position in Islam. That said, see what lies ahead of the Middle East. Now, for this corridor to become a success, this has to go to Jordan from Saudi Arabia, and from Jordan, how does it go to? For this to reach Haifa, Israel's other ports are on Red Sea. For this to reach Haifa, it has to cross Jordan. So Jordan will not be such a problem. Jordan has always collaborated with the West and always collaborated with the Saudi Arabians, and irrespective of what they say at any point of time, not since 1973. In fact, I would say in some ways not since 1967 have Jordanians really been such enemies of Israel since 1973. Not at all, whatever the pretense, whatever they might say. So if this reaches Israel, and from there it goes to Europe. And again the question will be, where does it go in Europe? Now the original Chinese BRI was going to take these goods from Asia, from any of the Asian ports. It was going to be most likely Haifa itself, because Chinese also own a part of the Haifa port. It would have gone to Trieste in Italy. Now, if Italy goes out of BRI, that is out, and the Chinese can still build a BRI, but minus Italy in that role, because Italy has said that while they are pulling out of BRI, they would like to revisit their 2004 strategic partnership with China, which has been abandoned over time. So they are giving the Chinese a consolation prize. They are not fighting with the Chinese. But in this case, the route might be one of the ports in Greece. And the port that has been mentioned often is the port of Piraeus. Piraeus is not far from Athens. Piraeus is a sizable port. It also has the capacity of being expanded. So effectively what this does is, this creates a route around the big forbidden land masses of the world. That is Iran, Iraq, Russia, Ukraine, and how can I forget Syria? Because if Syria was more open and Syria was also a normal state, then you didn't have to go through so much of the sea. You could have actually built railway lines and highways through Syria, and that would have taken you into Europe. But that is not the option right now, although we don't know what might happen in the future. Now, where did this idea come from? If you read a story in Axios by Barack Ravid has been on this story for a long time. He's been saying that this idea was proposed almost 2 years back. It came up and it was discussed, but more specifically, and see his tweet, and more specifically he says the UAE Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed mentioned this to the Americans, to Biden, on his visit to the US in February. In fact, he also points to the fact, Barack Ravid also points to the fact that Biden at the announcement of the corridor actually said, specially thanked Sheikh Mohammed, obviously because he acknowledged it as being his idea. Now in May, if the idea began then in May, when Ajit Doval, our national security advisor, visited Washington, he and Jake Sullivan discussed this. That also has been covered by the mainstream media in the US. This idea had come up, and it was also in the month of May that Jake Sullivan made a visit to Saudi Arabia to discuss it with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and other Saudi high officials. And once everybody had agreed on this, that's when movement on this took place. But intellectually, where did the idea come in? Everybody says, what are think tanks worth? Think tanks waste time. They just have conferences, argue among themselves, they have no impact. That's not always true. A lot of the big things that have happened in the world, even Marshall Plan, a lot of the things, at least since the Second World War that we've tracked more closely, have come out of some people's thinking, some intellectuals' minds. In this case, I particularly refer to a paper by Professor Michael Tanchum. I hope I pronounce his name right. It's a Spanish name, I think. Professor Michael Tanchum, who teaches international relations and political economy at a bunch of universities as a professor and also as a fellow. In fact, if I started listing all his affiliations for you, it might take a long time. But he wrote a paper in 2021. He wrote a paper in 2021 titled India's Arab Mediterranean corridor, a paradigm shift in strategic connectivity to Europe. Now, if you see that paper, and I'm sharing the entire paper with you as a link, not hard copy, don't worry. So you can open it and you can see the paper. Now, the important thing is that even in his imagination, what he imagined was pretty much what is happening right now. So I can't believe that nobody made a reference to this or nobody saw this as a germination of the idea. Now, he also drew some kind of a map here, which you will see enlarged on your screen. Now, this map, I could redraw this map, in fact, and don't jump Adani, because the fact is that this map begins at Mumbai, at the Mumbai ports. From Mumbai port, it goes to UAE ports and Saudi ports, etc. And then the railway takes it forward. The important thing, however, is that Mumbai is still way further south. And Mumbai is also a very crowded and very overstretched port right now. JNPT is a very overstretched port, very little excess capacity right now. The port that the Adanis run, Mundra, which is somewhere higher up, and you will see on your map, higher up means this is closer to the Arabian coast, much closer to the Arabian coast than the Mumbai coast. And that's also very close to some of India's foremost petroleum goods exporting installations. That is the Reliance refinery at Jamnagar and also the Nayara refinery, the former SR Oil refinery. All of that's there. Also, Mundra is a very efficient port, one of the most efficient in the world. It's a large port. It's also a very expandable port. And it also has a lot of rail connectivity coming up. So once again, India's western coast has been getting ready. It's not as if Bombay JNPT will not benefit, but India's western coast now has the ability, because of whatever your politics and whatever your view on Adani, because of this really incredible port system that has been set up on the western coast. So India is ready to take advantage of it, at least in the seas. Now, before we conclude, we also have to do a little review of what the Chinese have been doing. What is the Chinese One Belt, One Road, OBOR or 1B, 1R story? Now, this was made when Xi Jinping rose to power 2013. This was one of his first ideas. And he made it part of what the Chinese call major country diplomacy. Major countries, not diplomacy among major countries. That means I'm a major country, my diplomacy. So they made it part of their major country diplomacy. They also made it in 2017. They also added it to the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. This became that important for them. Then they started splurging with debt, not splurging with grants. They started splurging with debt, and a lot of the countries, the poorer countries of what is described, in my view, erroneously, and I don't like that expression, erroneously, as the global south. So the Chinese began scattering this money as debt in the global south. You build this highway, you need money, I'll give you money, interest is this much, and what you're building is mortgaged to me, you can't pay, I'll take it from you. You want to see an example? Look at the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Never mind that it happened to fall in the constituency of then President Mahinda Rajapaksa. So the Chinese built a lot of these linkages. Over time, 155 countries joined this One Belt, One Road initiative. 155 countries, very few remain. 155 countries joined it, accounting for about 75% of the world's population and anything between 30 to 35% of the global economy. That tells you that maybe 25, 30% of the population stayed out, but 70%, that population accounted for 70% of the global economy, that stayed out. What this became, therefore, was one organization run by one very rich country, very rich and increasingly rich country, namely China, with many other particularly poor country or poorer country who were desperate for easy debt. It wasn't cheap debt, it was easy debt. Now the Chinese then came up with two ideas. So the first idea Xi Jinping unveiled in September 2013, that was on his visit to Kazakhstan. He called it the Silk Road Economic Belt. That's how it started. Silk Road, as you know, takes you back to the history of 12th, 13th century travelers, Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, one a Christian, one an Arab and Muslim, So it takes you back to those times. That was the Silk Route. And he thought he was going to replicate the Silk Route now, obviously with modern railways and modern highways. At the same time, in the course of time, he came up with a second idea. And the second idea was that, look, if I am replicating through the plains, through the Central Asian and European landmass, what Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta did, let me do through the seas what the famous Chinese, the Ming Dynasty and Zheng He, what they did through the seas. So he thought he'd build the second part of this through the seas. So he then decided to build a 21st century maritime Silk Route. Maritime means through the seas. So goods will go from port to port to port to port. That's how ports came up in Myanmar. That's how Djibouti. That's how Gwadar, etc. And then they will reach wherever the Chinese wanted to take these goods to, either through Suez Canal or someplace else. So this was very imaginative. The important thing in conclusion to understand about the Chinese plan is that what the Chinese called a belt is actually a road or railways. That will go from China either north and then south. Will go through Central Asia, Russia, etc. into Europe. That is mostly road and railways. That is what they call as belt. So that is the belt in OBOR. What they call as road is not a road at all, because that is a string of ports, or what is sometimes also described in strategic community as a string of pearls. So what is called a belt is actually a road, and what is called a road is actually just sea lanes. That's the way the Chinese do their business, and now they have competition.